The massive amphitheater on Vortania Prime buzzed with quiet conversation as hundreds of alien students settled into their seats. The building stretched high into the purple sky, its crystal walls catching the light from the planet's twin suns. Students from dozens of different worlds filled the curved rows of seats, their various forms creating a colorful display of scales, fur, tentacles, and metallic skin. Professor Zethkalar stepped onto the central platform with the confidence of someone who had given this lecture many times before. His tall, thin frame moved with practiced grace, and his forearms gestured elegantly as he activated the holographic display system. The Zenthari professor had taught at Galactic University for over 40 years, and his expertise in primitive species studies was known throughout the academic community. Welcome, students, to another session of comparative xenobiology, Zethkalar announced, his voice carrying easily through the amphitheater's advanced sound system. Today we will examine one of the most amusing examples of primitive species mythology. We will study the humans of Earth and their ridiculous attempts to glorify their own inadequacies through fantasy stories. The first holographic image appeared above the platform, showing an ancient human warrior holding a sword. The professor's long fingers pointed at the display with obvious disdain. Look at this primitive creature. The humans call this figure heroic because he supposedly fought against impossible odds. They create these stories because their species is naturally weak and short-lived. They cannot accept their own limitations, so they invent tales of greatness. That never actually happened. Several students in the front rows took notes on their digital tablets, while others leaned forward with interest. A group of young Thoraxians chittered among themselves, their insect-like faces showing amusement at the professor's presentation. Zethkalar changed the image to show a human space battle from Earth's historical archives. Here we see another example of human delusion. They claim that small groups of their warriors defeated much larger enemy forces through something they call courage and determination. Any logical analysis shows that such victories would be mathematically impossible. These are clearly fictional accounts designed to make their species feel better about their natural cowardice. The professor's voice grew more mocking as he continued. The humans have hundreds of these stories. They speak of individuals who sacrificed themselves to save others, of warriors who never retreated from battle, of leaders who inspired their followers to achieve the impossible. All of this is clearly compensatory mythology created by a species that knows it is inferior to most other galactic civilizations. Near the back of the amphitheater, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat quietly among a group of exchange students from various worlds. The human officer wore the simple gray uniform of the Terran Defense Corps, and his presence in the lecture hall was part of a diplomatic exchange program between Earth and the Galactic University. Morrison had been attending various academic sessions for the past 3 weeks, learning about alien cultures and sharing human perspectives when invited to do so. Morrison's jaw tightened as he listened to the professor's dismissive words. He had served in the Terran Defense Corps for 15 years and had seen firsthand the kind of courage and sacrifice that Zethkalar was calling fictional. The human officer had fought in 3 major conflicts and had witnessed acts of heroism that would challenge everything the professor was teaching. The holographic display changed again, this time showing images of human medals and decorations. Zethkalar laughed, the sound echoing through the amphitheater. Look at these primitive trinkets. The humans give these metal objects to each other as rewards for acts that they claim demonstrate exceptional bravery. They have created an entire culture around the worship of fictional heroes because they cannot face the reality of their own weakness. A vegan student in the middle section raised one of her tentacles to ask a question. Professor, have you ever actually studied detailed human historical records? Some of their documented battles seem to contain verifiable data. Zethkalar waved dismissively with 2 of his forearms. My dear student, primitive species are very good at creating convincing fiction. They mix small amounts of truth with large amounts of fantasy to make their stories seem believable. No logical species would send small forces against overwhelming odds. No rational being would sacrifice their own life for strangers. These behaviors go against basic survival instincts and evolutionary logic. Morrison felt his hands clench into fists as the professor continued his mockery. The human officer thought about his friend Captain Ben Parker, who had died shielding civilian transports from enemy fire during the Proxima incident. He remembered Sergeant Amy Rodriguez, who had held a mountain pass for 6 hours against an entire enemy battalion to give her unit time to evacuate wounded soldiers. These were real people, real heroes, not mythological figures. The professor activated another series of images showing human art and literature. Notice how the humans always portray themselves as noble and selfless in their cultural works. This is classic psychological compensation. Species that are naturally selfish and cowardly often create fictional ideals to distract from their true nature. The humans cannot accept that they are simply another mediocre species struggling to survive in a hostile universe. Several alien students nodded in agreement, finding the professor's analysis convincing. A young crystalline being in the front row sparkled with what appeared to be amusement, while a group of methane breathers in their environmental suits made sounds that indicated approval of the lecture's direction. Morrison could no longer remain silent. The human officer had listened to enough mockery of his species and his fallen comrades. He stood up slowly in his seat, his movement drawing attention from nearby students. The amphitheater gradually grew quiet as more beings noticed the standing human. Professor Zethkalar paused in his lecture and looked up toward the back rows. His large eyes focused on Morrison with interest rather than concern. The professor had never had a human directly challenge his teachings before, and he saw this as an excellent opportunity to demonstrate his theories in real time. It appears we have a representative of the species in question with us today, Zethkalar announced to the entire amphitheater. Please, human, do not hesitate to share your thoughts. I am sure your perspective will provide an excellent example of the compensatory mythology I have been describing. Morrison walked down the steps of the amphitheater with steady, measured steps. Every alien eye in the massive hall followed his movement as he made his way toward the central platform. The human officer's face remained calm, but his colleagues in the Terran Defense Corps would have recognized the dangerous quiet in his expression. Professor Zethkalar watched the approaching human with obvious amusement. The alien academic gestured gracefully toward Morrison with 2 of his forearms, encouraging him to continue down to the speaking area. Please come closer so everyone can hear you properly. I am most interested in your response to my analysis of human mythology. Morrison reached the bottom of the amphitheater and stepped onto the platform beside the professor. The holographic display still showed images of human medals and decorations, the very symbols that Zethkalar had been mocking moments before. Morrison looked up at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at him, then turned to address the professor directly. Professor Zethkalar, I have been listening to your lecture with great interest. Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the amplification system. However, I must respectfully disagree with several of your conclusions about human culture and history. The professor's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. Of course you disagree. This is exactly the response I would expect from a member of your species. You have been conditioned since birth to believe in these heroic fantasies. It is natural that you would resist logical analysis of your cultural myths. That is where you are wrong, Professor, Morrison replied calmly. What you call myths and fantasies are actually documented historical events. The heroes you dismiss as fictional characters were real people who performed real acts of courage and sacrifice. A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. Several students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that this exchange might become more heated than a typical academic discussion. The Thoraxian students stopped their chittering and focused their compound eyes on the two figures standing on the platform. Zethkalar waved one of his hands dismissively. "Please, Lieutenant Commander Morrison, do not insult the intelligence of our students with such obvious fabrications. Even if we assume that some of these stories have a basis in historical fact, they have certainly been exaggerated beyond all recognition. No species evolves the kind of selfless behavior that your legends describe." Morrison felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Professor, have you ever actually read the detailed military reports from the conflicts you are discussing? Have you examined the witness testimonies, the battlefield recordings, the official documentation that supports these accounts?" "I have reviewed the available materials," the professor replied with a tone that suggested he found the question insulting. "Primitive species are notorious for creating convincing false records to support their mythologies. Your people are no different from dozens of other backward civilizations that we have studied." The human officer reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small data tablet. "Then perhaps you would be interested in examining some primary source materials that might challenge your assumptions." Morrison activated the device and connected it to the amphitheater's display system. "With your permission, I would like to share some verified historical records." Several alien students began typing rapidly on their own devices, apparently researching the claims that Morrison was making. A group of vegan exchange students near the middle of the amphitheater were particularly active, their tentacles moving quickly over their tablet screens. Zethkalar gestured for Morrison to proceed, clearly confident that whatever evidence the human presented would be easily dismissed. "By all means, show us these verified records you speak of. I am sure they will provide an excellent example of how primitive species manipulate data to support their preferred narratives." Morrison's tablet connected to the holographic display system, and the images of medals and decorations were replaced by an official military report. The document bore the seals of multiple government agencies and included detailed, technical specifications that would be difficult to fabricate. "This is the after-action report from the Battle of Kepler Station," Morrison explained, pointing to specific sections of the document. "During this engagement, a force of 87 human Marines held off over 2,000 enemy soldiers for 6 days while civilian transports evacuated the station. The enemy had superior numbers, better equipment, and control of the orbital space around the station." The professor studied the document with a critical eye. "Even assuming this report is genuine, which I doubt, it merely describes a military action. Where is the exceptional heroism that your species is so fond of claiming?" Morrison changed the display to show casualty reports and individual commendations. Sergeant First Class Amy Rodriguez was wounded on the second day of fighting but refused medical evacuation. She maintained her position in the main corridor for 4 more days, personally accounting for over 300 enemy casualties. When her ammunition ran out, she used explosives to collapse the corridor and stop the enemy advance, knowing that she would not survive the blast. A hush fell over the amphitheater as students absorbed this information. The crystalline being in the front row had stopped sparkling, and even the methane breathers in their environmental suits had grown silent. Rodriguez was posthumously awarded the Stellar Cross for extraordinary heroism, Morrison continued. Her actions saved the lives of over 15,000 civilians, who were still evacuating from the lower levels of the station. This is not mythology, Professor. This is documented fact witnessed by hundreds of people and recorded by multiple independent sources. Zethkalar's confident expression had begun to waver, but he maintained his dismissive tone. One cannot base broad conclusions about an entire species on isolated incidents. Even if your Sergeant Rodriguez existed and performed these actions, she would represent an extreme aberration rather than typical human behavior. Morrison smiled grimly and changed the display again. Then perhaps you would like to examine the records from the Proxima incident, the defense of New Geneva, the Martian colonial wars, and approximately 400 other documented conflicts, where humans demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and sacrifice that you claim is impossible. The vegan student who had asked the earlier question raised her tentacle again. "Professor, I have been checking the galactic database during this discussion. These events are all listed in our own historical archives with corroborating evidence from multiple species." Other students began calling out similar findings from their research. A young Xanthari near the back of the amphitheater announced that he had found video recordings of several battles that Morrison had mentioned. The mood in the room was shifting as more evidence emerged to support the human officer's claims. Professor Zethkalar found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His academic reputation was built on his expertise in primitive species studies, and his confident dismissal of human achievements was being systematically challenged by verifiable facts. Morrison activated his data tablet again and connected it to the university's main quantum communication array. The holographic display showed a connection request to the Terran Defense Corps' archives on Earth. Professor Zethkalar watched with growing unease as the human officer prepared to access additional evidence from his home world. "What I have shown you so far is just a small sample of documented human heroism," Morrison said, addressing both the professor and the audience of alien students. "If you truly want to understand human nature, we need to examine the complete historical record, not just cherry-picked examples that support predetermined theories." The connection to Earth established successfully, and Morrison began accessing military databases that contained thousands of after-action reports, witness testimonies, and verified battlefield recordings. The amphitheater's main display split into multiple screens, each showing different documents and video files. "Here is the complete record of Captain Ben Parker's actions during the asteroid belt mining crisis," Morrison announced, pulling up a detailed file. When pirates attacked a convoy of civilian mining ships, Captain Parker commanded the escort vessel USS Liberty. He was outnumbered 10-1 and facing ships with superior firepower. The display showed tactical diagrams of the battle, with timestamp data and radio communications transcripts. Zethkalar studied the information carefully, looking for inconsistencies or signs of fabrication. Several alien students had pulled out advanced analysis devices and were scanning the documents for authenticity markers. Morrison continued his presentation. Parker could have retreated to the nearest military base and called for reinforcements. Instead, he positioned his ship between the pirates and the civilian convoy. For 3 hours, he fought off wave after wave of attacks while the mining ships escaped to safety. The tactical display showed the Liberty's position throughout the battle, illustrating how Parker had maneuvered his single ship to protect multiple civilian vessels. Radio communications played through the amphitheater's sound system, capturing Parker's calm voice directing the evacuation even as his ship took heavy damage. In the final phase of the battle, Parker's ship was critically damaged and losing life support, Morrison explained. He had enough power for one last action. He could either retreat to save his crew, or make a final attack run to ensure the pirates could not pursue the escaping civilians. The audio recording played Captain Parker's final transmission. "Liberty to all civilian vessels, you are clear to jump to hyperspace. It has been an honor to serve with you." The recording captured the sound of Parker's ship launching its final attack against the pirate flagship, resulting in both vessels being destroyed. A heavy silence filled the amphitheater. As the recording ended, many of the alien students appeared moved by what they had heard, and even some of the more skeptical species showed signs of emotional response. The crystalline being in the front row was now pulsing with soft blue light, which Morrison recognized. As a sign of respect among their people, Professor Zethkalar cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "While this Captain Parker may have existed and performed these actions, you are still presenting isolated cases. One cannot judge an entire species based on the behavior of a few exceptional individuals. Morrison smiled and accessed another set of files. Then let us examine the behavior of ordinary humans in extraordinary situations. The display changed to show civilian rescue operations during natural disasters, with thousands of individual reports of people risking their lives to help strangers. During the Great Flood on New Texas Colony, over 40,000 civilians were trapped in the lowland settlements, Morrison continued. The government had enough transport capacity to evacuate only half the population before the floodwaters reached critical levels. The display showed aerial footage of the disaster zone, with rising water levels threatening entire communities. Emergency evacuation plans indicated that difficult choices would have to be made about who could be saved. According to your theories, Professor, the humans should have fought each other for the limited evacuation spaces. The strong should have abandoned the weak to save themselves. That would be the logical, evolutionarily sound response to a survival situation. Zethkalar nodded slowly. Exactly. Any rational species would prioritize survival of the fittest during such a crisis. Resources would naturally go to those most capable of contributing to the species' future survival. Morrison activated video recordings from the evacuation. Instead, this is what actually happened. The footage showed human evacuation teams consistently prioritizing children, elderly, and disabled individuals for rescue. Healthy adults repeatedly gave up their seats on transport ships to ensure that more vulnerable people could escape. Here, we see mining engineer Jack Thompson, who gave his evacuation seat to an elderly woman he had never met before. Morrison narrated as the video played. Thompson was a skilled professional whose survival would have been valuable to the colony's reconstruction efforts. Yet he chose to stay behind and help with rescue operations instead of saving himself. The video showed Thompson and dozens of other volunteers working frantically to save trapped civilians as the flood waters continued to rise. Many of these volunteers knew they might not survive, but they continued their rescue efforts anyway. A Thoraxian student in the middle section stood up, her insect-like mandibles clicking with agitation. Professor, this behavior makes no evolutionary sense. Why would healthy individuals sacrifice their survival chances for genetically unrelated strangers? Before Zethkalar could respond, a vegan student called out from another section. I have been researching similar incidents in the galactic database. There are hundreds of documented cases of humans behaving this way during emergencies. This appears to be typical behavior for their species, not exceptional cases. More students began sharing their research findings. A young Xanthari had discovered records of human peacekeeping missions where soldiers had died protecting alien civilians. A group of methane breathers had found documentation of human medical volunteers who had worked in plague zones on other worlds. Knowing they faced almost certain death, Professor Zethkalar found his academic theories crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence. The human behavior patterns that Morrison was demonstrating contradicted everything the professor thought he knew about evolutionary psychology and species survival instincts. The debate between Morrison and Professor Zethkalar had reached a critical point when the university's communication system suddenly activated with an urgent priority signal. A mechanical voice echoed through the amphitheater, announcing an incoming transmission from the Terran Defense Corps' headquarters. Attention, Professor Zethkalar and students of Galactic University. This is Admiral Lisa Carter of the Terran Defense Corps requesting immediate communication access. We have received reports of an academic discussion regarding human military history and would like to contribute to the conversation. Morrison's eyes widened with surprise and recognition. He knew Admiral Carter well from his years of service, but he had not expected his former commanding officer to involve herself in this academic dispute. The human officer quickly stepped forward to authorize the communication link. Admiral Carter, this is Lieutenant Commander Morrison. permission granted for full communication access. The amphitheater's main holographic display flickered and then resolved into a three-dimensional image of Admiral Lisa Carter. Even through the quantum communication link, her presence immediately commanded attention from every being in the massive hall. Carter stood in what appeared to be her private office, wearing the dress uniform of the Terran Defense Corps with numerous medals and decorations visible on her chest. Admiral Carter was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. 3 long scars ran across the left side of her face, souvenirs from a boarding action during the Centauri War. Her uniform displayed the ribbons and medals of someone who had served in every major human conflict of the past 30 years. "Professor Zeph Kalar," Carter said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I understand you have been teaching your students that human military achievements are fictional stories created by a primitive species. I thought it might be helpful to provide some first-hand perspective on these matters." Zeph Kalar stood frozen on the platform, clearly not prepared for this development. The professor had spent decades studying primitive species from the safety of his academic position, but he had never actually spoken with a genuine military leader from any of the cultures he analyzed. "Admiral Carter," Zeph Kalar managed to say, "I appreciate your interest in our academic discussion. However, I must point out that anecdotal evidence from interested parties cannot be considered objective data in a scholarly environment." Carter smiled, and the expression was not entirely friendly. "Professor, I am not here to provide anecdotal evidence. I am here to correct factual errors in your presentation. Lieutenant Commander Morrison has shown you documented proof of human military achievements. I am here to provide additional context that your research apparently missed." The Admiral gestured to someone off-screen, and additional data began streaming to the university's communication system. Files, video recordings, and official documents appeared on multiple display screens around the amphitheater. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. "These are the complete military records for the past 50 years of human conflict," Carter explained. "Every battle, every campaign, every individual act of heroism that your research dismissed as mythology. The files include witness testimonies from allied species, enemy battle reports, and independent verification from neutral observers." One of the screens showed a video recording of Carter herself during the Battle of Proxima Station. The footage was clearly authentic, showing a much younger Carter leading a desperate boarding action against a heavily defended enemy position. The recording captured her calm leadership under fire and her refusal to abandon wounded soldiers, even when retreat was the logical choice. This recording was made by Xanthari war correspondents during the Proxima campaign. Carter continued, looking directly at Professor Zeph Kalar. "Your own people documented these events and filed reports with the Galactic Historical Archive. Did your research not include sources from your own species?" Zeph Kalar's face showed visible embarrassment as he realized that his research had been far less thorough than he had claimed. Several Xanthari students in the audience began searching their own cultural databases, quickly finding the documents that Carter had referenced. "Admiral," said a vegan student from the middle section, "the professor has been teaching us that human behavior patterns are inconsistent with evolutionary survival instincts. How do you explain the tendency of your species to sacrifice individual survival for the benefit of others?" Carter nodded thoughtfully. "That is an excellent question. The answer lies in understanding what humans consider to be survival. We do not measure survival solely in terms of individual biological continuity. We measure it in terms of the survival of our values, our communities, and our responsibilities to others." The Admiral activated another display showing civilian rescue operations during various disasters. When Captain Ben Parker sacrificed his life to save those mining ships, he was not acting against survival instincts. He was acting to ensure the survival of something more important than his individual existence. But that makes no logical sense, protested a Thoraxian student. Individual survival is the primary evolutionary drive for all species. Sacrificing oneself for unrelated individuals provides no genetic advantage. Carter's expression grew serious. You are thinking too narrowly about what constitutes survival advantage. Humans have learned that our long-term survival as a species depends on our willingness to protect and support each other. A society where individuals only look out for themselves cannot survive the challenges that threaten entire civilizations. Morrison stepped forward to support his former commander's explanation. Professor Zethkalar, you have been analyzing human behavior through the lens of individual survival. But humans are fundamentally social creatures. Our survival strategies are based on group cohesion and mutual support, not individual competition. Admiral Carter activated one final display showing casualty statistics from human military conflicts. Professor, you claimed that no rational species would send small forces against overwhelming odds. But sometimes the survival of your civilization requires exactly that kind of sacrifice. Sometimes you must risk everything to protect what matters most. The statistics showed that human military forces had consistently achieved victory against superior numbers through superior tactics, training, and willingness to sacrifice for the mission. The data came from multiple independent sources and could not be dismissed as human propaganda. These are not stories, Professor, Carter concluded. These are the actions of real people who understood that some things are more important than individual survival. They fought and died to protect others because they knew that a civilization that abandons its principles to save itself has already lost everything worth saving. Professor Zethkalar stood silently on the platform, surrounded by overwhelming evidence that contradicted every assumption he had made about human nature and capabilities. Professor Zethkalar stood motionless on the platform, his forearms hanging at his sides as he stared at the overwhelming evidence displayed around the amphitheater. The holographic image of Admiral Carter waited patiently for his response. While hundreds of alien students watched in complete silence, the professor's confident demeanor had crumbled entirely, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his life's work contained fundamental errors. Admiral Carter, Zethkalar finally managed to speak, his voice much quieter than it had been during his earlier lecture. I must admit that the evidence you and Lieutenant Commander Morrison have presented challenges many of my previous conclusions about human behavior patterns. Carter nodded respectfully. Professor, I understand that changing established academic theories is never easy. However, I hope you can see that your research methods may have been incomplete. Studying a species from a distance, without direct contact or comprehensive source material, can lead to significant misunderstandings. The professor looked around at his students, many of whom were still actively researching human military history on their personal devices. The vegan students had found records of human peacekeeping missions on their home world, while the Zentari students were discovering their own species. Positive reports about human allies during various conflicts. Professor, called out the young Zentari student who had been researching throughout the discussion, I have found over 300 documented cases of humans risking their lives to save members of other species. These reports come from our own military archives and are classified as highly reliable sources. A Thoraxian student added, the medical databases show that human doctors and nurses have volunteered for dangerous assignments on dozens of worlds affected by plague and natural disasters. Many of them died helping people they had never met before. Professor Zethkalar felt the weight of academic responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He had built his reputation on his expertise in primitive species studies, and now he was being confronted with clear evidence that his conclusions had been wrong. The professor realized that his dismissive attitude had prevented him from conducting proper research. Admiral Carter, Zethkalar said formally, I owe you and your entire species an apology. My research was clearly inadequate, and my conclusions were based on incomplete data and personal assumptions rather than objective analysis. Carter's stern expression softened slightly. Professor, I appreciate your honesty. However, I think there is a more constructive way to address this situation than simply acknowledging past mistakes. The Admiral gestured toward the displays, still showing human military and civilian achievements. Rather than dwelling on errors, I would like to propose a collaborative approach to future research. The Terran Defense Corps would be willing to provide access to our complete historical archives, including classified materials that have never been made available to outside researchers. Morrison stepped forward to support his former commanders. Proposal. Professor, Admiral Carter is offering you an opportunity that no academic researcher has ever received before. Complete access to primary source materials, interviews with actual participants, and guided tours of historical sites where these events took place. The offer clearly interested Zethkalar, but he hesitated. Admiral, I must ask why you would be willing to share such sensitive information with someone who has spent years misrepresenting your people's achievements. Carter smiled, and this time the expression was genuinely warm. Professor, because true academic scholarship requires accurate information and multiple perspectives. You have the analytical skills and academic credentials to conduct proper research. You simply lacked access to complete and accurate source materials. Furthermore, Carter continued, this kind of collaboration benefits everyone involved. Your students will receive better education based on factual information rather than outdated assumptions. Human culture will be better understood throughout the galaxy, and other species may benefit from studying successful examples of cooperation and sacrifice. A crystalline student in the front row pulsed with curious light patterns. Admiral Carter, would this collaboration include opportunities for direct cultural exchange? Many of us would be interested in learning more about human society and values. Absolutely. Carter replied. We have exchange programs available for students, researchers, and academics who want to study human culture firsthand. Direct experience is always better than theoretical analysis when it comes to understanding another species. Professor Zethkalar straightened his posture and addressed the Admiral formally. Admiral Carter, I accept your generous offer of collaboration. I would be honored to work with you and your people to create more accurate academic materials about human culture and achievements. Carter nodded approvingly. Excellent. I will have my staff prepare comprehensive research packages for you and any of your students who wish to participate in the exchange program. We can begin with complete documentation of the battles and events that were discussed today. Morrison felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched the professor transform from a dismissive critic into a genuine scholar interested in learning the truth. The human officer had hoped to defend his species' reputation, but the outcome had exceeded his expectations. Professor Zethkalar, Morrison said, I want you to know that humans respect honest academic inquiry. We understand that mistakes can happen when researchers work with limited information. What matters is the willingness to correct those mistakes when better evidence becomes available. The professor looked at Morrison with newfound respect. Lieutenant Commander, you and Admiral Carter have taught me an important lesson about the dangers of academic arrogance. I allowed my preconceptions to cloud my judgment and prevented me from seeking out accurate information. Admiral Carter prepared to end the communication link. Professor, I look forward to working with you on future research projects. I believe this collaboration will benefit students throughout the galaxy by providing them with accurate information about interspecies cooperation and understanding. As Carter's holographic image faded, the amphitheater remained quiet for several moments. Then the alien students began talking excitedly among themselves, discussing the implications of what they had learned and expressing interest in the proposed exchange programs. Professor Zethkalar gathered his materials and prepared to leave the platform, but he paused to address his students one final time. Today, we have all learned an important lesson about the necessity of thorough research and open minds in academic work. Our next lecture will focus on developing better methodologies for cross-cultural studies. Morrison walked up the steps toward the exit, feeling proud of what had been accomplished. He had successfully defended human honor while also opening doors for better understanding between species. As he reached the door, he could hear excited conversations in dozens of languages as students made plans to apply for the human exchange programs. The legend had appeared, the truth had been told, and the galaxy had gained a better understanding of what it truly meant to be human.